The Oklahoma Territory stretched endlessly under a pewter sky, autumn winds carrying the scent of dying grass and distant rain. Samuel Crawford stood at the edge of Stillwater's only trading post, his weathered hands gripping the wooden rail, as it were the last solid thing in a world gone mad. The war had ended 27 years ago, but its echoes still thundered in his chest every morning when silence pressed too heavy against his ears. $5 silver, the man beside him said, voice cracked like old leather. She's strong, works hard. Kiowa blood, but she speaks English good enough. The uncle, if that's what he truly was, shifted nervously, his own desperation bleeding to the practiced indifference. Times were harder than anyone wanted to admit, and Samuel had seen enough broken men to recognize another. The girl stood 3 steps away, maybe 16, maybe younger. Her dark eyes held something that made Samuel's throat tighten. Not fear, exactly, but a watchful stillness that reminded him of deer at the forest edge, calculating distance and danger. She wore a faded calico dress that had seen better years, her long black hair braided with strips of red cloth that caught the weak sunlight like small flames. "Don't need no house help," Samuel heard himself say, though his voice sounded strange, rusty from disuse. He'd spoken more words in the past hour than he had in the previous month. The silence of his ranch had become his refuge, the only place where memories couldn't ambush him with their sudden violence. "Ain't just house help," the uncle pressed, desperation sharpening his tone. "She knows stories. Old ones. Kiowa stories." He glanced at the girl, something passing between them. Grief, maybe, or regret. Stories that... He stopped, seeming to realize how foolish it sounded. Samuel's gaze drifted back to the girl. She hadn't spoken once, but her eyes followed the conversation with fierce intelligence. There was something in her stillness that pulled at him, like recognizing your own reflection in dark water. They were both refugees, he realized. She from whatever circumstances had brought her here, he from the noise inside his own head that never stopped, not even in sleep. The trading post door slammed behind them as another customer left, the sound sharp as gunfire. Samuel flinched involuntarily, his shoulders drawing tight. The girl noticed, of course she did. Nothing escaped those dark eyes. But instead of the pity or fear he usually saw when people caught him in these moments, she simply looked away, granting him dignity he hadn't expected. "Stories," he repeated, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had told him a story that wasn't carved in screams or painted in blood across the inside of his eyelids. The uncle sensed advantage. She's got the old ways in her head. Her grandmother was a keeper of words before... He gestured vaguely westward, toward the reservations, toward everything that had been lost or taken or buried under the weight of progress. Samuel pulled $5 silver from his coat pocket, feeling their weight like stones. The girl's eyes followed the money but showed no relief, no gratitude, just that same watchful calculation. Smart girl. She understood that being bought was just the beginning, not the end. "What's your name?" Samuel asked her directly, his voice gentler than he'd intended. "Ayanna," she said, the first word he'd heard from her lips. It sounded like water over stones, like wind through grass. "Means eternal blossom in my grandmother's tongue." Samuel nodded, pocketing the silver again. "Well, Ayanna, looks like you're coming home with me." The word home felt strange in his mouth, loaded with meanings he'd forgotten how to carry. His ranch was just a place where he existed, where silence was absolute and memories could be held at bay by the rhythms of work and weather. As they walked toward his wagon, Ayanna's soft footsteps beside his boots, Samuel wondered what story she carried, what words might fill the hollow spaces that had grown too large inside him. He didn't believe in healing, had stopped believing in most things after Shiloh, but something in her presence suggested possibilities he thought were buried with better men than himself. The wagon wheels began their familiar creak against the rutted road, carrying them both toward whatever waited in the space between silence and story, between two kinds of solitude that might, perhaps, learn to speak the same language. 23 miles from Stillwater, Samuel's ranch sprawled across a valley that seemed carved from the sky itself. The house sat low against the horizon, weathered cedar and stone that had learned to bend with prairie winds rather than break. Ayana studied it as their wagon crested the final hill, noting how it seemed to grow from the earth rather than impose upon it, like the old lodges her grandmother had described in whispered stories. "Built it myself," Samuel said, his first word since leaving town. After the war. The admission hung between them, heavy as the silence that followed. Ayana understood wars. Not the white man's war that had scarred Samuel, but the older conflicts that had scattered her people like seeds on barren ground. Every structure here spoke of solitude chosen rather than forced, and she recognized the difference. The horses knew their way home, picking careful paths around prairie dog holes and scattered stones. Samuel's hands barely touched the reins, but Ayana noticed how his eyes constantly swept the horizon, old habits of watchfulness that never quite left soldiers, no matter how long the peace lasted. Her own grandmother had carried that same alertness, earned through decades of reading Danger in the Bend of Grass or The Flight of Birds. "That's the bunkhouse." Samuel pointed to a smaller building 50 yards from the main house. "You can stay there. Got a stove. Keeps warm enough." His voice carried no emotion, but Ayana caught the consideration beneath. He was offering her space, distance, the dignity of her own walls. Many men wouldn't have thought of such things. As they approached, a massive dog emerged from the house shadows. Part wolf by the look of him, gray and amber with eyes that missed nothing. He watched Ayana with careful neutrality, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply assessing this new presence in his carefully ordered world. "That's Ghost," Samuel said, climbing down from the wagon. "Found him as a pup, half dead from cold. Took 3 months before he let me touch him." There was something in how he said it, like he understood creatures who needed time to trust, who'd learned that survival meant keeping distance until safety was proven rather than promised. Ayana slipped from the wagon with practiced grace, her feet finding solid ground as naturally as water finds its level. Ghost approached slowly, and she extended her hand palm down, letting him catch her scent without threat or demand. The dog's tail didn't wag, but his ears relaxed fractionally, acceptance, if not friendship. "He likes you," Samuel observed, surprise coloring his voice. Took him 6 months to tolerate the preacher from town. The bunkhouse interior was sparse but clean, a narrow bed, a small table, a stone fireplace that would throw good heat in winter. Someone had left firewood stacked neatly beside the hearth, and fresh bedding lay folded on the quilted coverlet. Ayana recognized the signs of preparation, the quiet thoughtfulness of a man who understood what it meant to arrive somewhere with nothing but the clothes on your back. "There's a well behind the main house," Samuel said from the doorway, maintaining careful distance. "Supper's at sunset, if you're hungry. Nothing fancy, just what keeps a man alive." He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. I don't talk much. Haven't had cause to, living alone. If that suits you, we'll get along fine." Ayana nodded, understanding the boundaries he was drawing, the careful architecture of solitude he'd built around himself. "My grandmother always said silence can be its own kind of conversation," she replied, "between people who understand this language." Something shifted in Samuel's expression, not quite surprise, but recognition, like seeing his own thoughts reflected in unexpected places. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was a keeper of stories," Ayana said, settling onto the bed's edge. Said stories were like seeds. They could sleep in silence for years, waiting for the right season to grow. She met his eyes directly, without challenge or submission. Sometimes the longest silences come before the most important words. Samuel stood in the doorway for a long moment, absorbing this. Then he nodded once, sharp and definitive. "Supper's at sunset," he repeated, and disappeared into the gathering twilight, Ghost padding silently behind him. Alone in her new sanctuary, Ayana unpacked a few possessions she'd carried. A beaded hair ornament her grandmother had made, a small piece of flint that had belonged to her father, and a leather pouch containing sage and sweetgrass, the last remnants of a world that existed now only in memory and story. Outside, she could hear Samuel moving around his evening chores, the familiar rhythms of a man who'd learned to find comfort in routine rather than company. She pressed her palm against the window glass, feeling the night air's chill seeping through. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called each other across the vast emptiness, their voices carrying ancient conversations about territory and survival, loss and endurance. Ayana smiled slightly, recognizing the sound of her own people in their wild singing. Stories told without words, truths that needed no translation. Tomorrow would bring the real test of whether two kinds of silence could learn to coexist, whether stories could bridge the distance between a broken soldier and a displaced girl, both refugees in their own ways from worlds that no longer existed. Tomorrow would bring the real test of whether two kinds of silence could learn to coexist, whether stories could bridge the distance between a broken soldier and a displaced girl, both refugees in their own ways from worlds that no longer existed. Dawn came soft across the prairie, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Ayana of her grandmother's favorite beadwork. She woke to the sound of Samuel's boots on wooden planks, the creak of the main house door, and Ghost's low woof of greeting. Through her window, she watched man and dog move through their morning ritual, checking the horses, examining fence lines, carrying water from the well, all performed with the quiet efficiency of long practice. Samuel didn't call for her, didn't expect her presence. This wasn't the desperate neediness she'd feared, but something else entirely. A man so accustomed to solitude that he'd forgotten how to impose on others. Ayana dressed quickly and stepped outside, where the October air bit sharp against her cheeks and the endless sky seemed close enough to touch. "Morning," Samuel said when he saw her, his voice carefully neutral. He was splitting firewood near the main house, each swing of the axe precise and controlled. Muscles moved beneath his worn shirt with the rhythm of a man who'd learned to find peace in physical labor. "Coffee's on the stove if you want some." Ayana nodded and disappeared into his kitchen, a clean, spare space that held only necessities. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, black as prairie soil and twice as bitter. She poured 2 cups and carried them outside, offering one to Samuel without words. He accepted it with a nod that might have been gratitude, and they stood drinking in comfortable silence while Ghost supervised from his favorite spot in the morning sun. "What needs doing?" Ayana asked finally, setting her empty cup on the chopping block. The question seemed to surprise Samuel, as if he'd expected her to wait for instructions rather than offer partnership. "Fence lines down near the south pasture," he said after a moment. "Winter's coming. Need to keep the cattle close." He paused, studying her face. "It's hard work, cold work." "I'm not made of glass," Ayana replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "My hands know work." Something shifted in Samuel's expression. Not quite a smile, but a loosening around his eyes that suggested approval. "All right then. We'll need wire, pliers, and patience. Prairie wind doesn't respect man's intentions." They worked through the morning in companionable quiet, Ghost trailing behind as they walked the fence line. Samuel showed her how to tension wire properly, how to read the land for weak spots where water might undermine posts. Ayana's hands were quick and sure, learning the tool's language without need for repeated explanation. When they stopped to rest, sharing water from Samuel's canteen, she noticed how his shoulders had relaxed, how the constant vigilance in his eyes had softened. "You're not what I expected," he said suddenly, then looked embarrassed by his own honesty. "What did you expect?" Ayana asked, genuinely curious. "Trouble, I suppose. Fear. Questions I couldn't answer." Samuel pulled a piece of grass and worried it between his fingers. "Most folks want to know about the war, about why I live out here alone. Want to fix things that can't be fixed. Some breaks don't heal straight," Ayana observed, watching a hawk circle overhead. "My grandmother used to say the trick isn't pretending the crack isn't there, but learning to be strong in different ways." Samuel went very still, the grass dropping from his fingers. She sounded like she understood about difficult things. She survived the time when our people were driven from the old territories, lost 3 children to disease, a husband to soldiers. But she never stopped telling stories, never stopped believing that words could carry hope across any distance. Ayana's voice remained steady, matter of fact. She said broken places sometimes let in more light than whole ones ever could. They finished the fence work in deeper silence, but it felt different now, less cautious, more accepting. As they walked back toward the house, Ayana noticed small details that spoke of Samuel's character. Tools kept sharp and clean, gates that swung true on their hinges, the careful way he checked each animal's condition as they passed. "Supper?" Samuel asked as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. "I can cook," Ayanna offered, "if you don't mind sharing your kitchen." Samuel hesitated, and she could see him wrestling with the intimacy of shared space, shared meals. I don't know how to be around people anymore," he admitted quietly. "Good thing I'm not people, then," Ayanna said with the faintest hint of humor. "I'm just someone who knows how to make beans taste like something besides leather." That got her what might have been Samuel's first smile in years, brief as prairie lightning but unmistakably real. "Well then," he said, "I reckon that makes you more valuable than most." As they approached the house, Ghost trotting contentedly between them, Ayanna felt something she hadn't experienced since her grandmother's death. The possibility of belonging somewhere, not as property or burden, but as herself. And perhaps in the careful space they were building between them, two wounded souls might find that healing didn't require forgetting. Only the courage to trust that stories, like hope, could grow in the most unlikely soil. The kitchen, filled with the scent of cornbread and beans seasoned with wild onions Ayanna had spotted growing near the creek. Samuel sat at his rough-hewn table, watching her move through a space with quiet efficiency. She didn't rearrange anything or impose her presence, simply worked around his habits like water flowing around stones. "Smells better than anything I've managed in 5 years," Samuel admitted, accepting the plate she set before him. The food was simple but transformed, the beans rich with herbs he couldn't name, the cornbread golden and tender. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" "My grandmother. She could make a feast from nothing but prairie grass and stubbornness." Ayanna settled across from him, her own plate modest, said cooking was just another kind of storytelling. You take whatever you have and make it into something that feeds more than just a body. Samuel chewed thoughtfully, tasting layers of flavor he'd forgotten food could hold. "What other stories did she tell you?" The question surprised him. He hadn't meant to ask, hadn't realized the words were forming until they escaped. Ayanna's eyes brightened slightly, like coals touched by wind. "All kinds. Stories about how the world began, why the seasons change, what happens when people forget how to listen to the land." She paused, studying his face. Stories about healing, too. About wars that end not with victory, but with understanding. "Don't know much about that kind of ending," Samuel said quietly, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. Neither did the warriors in her stories, at first, but grandmother said that's what made them worth telling. They were about learning something new, not just fighting something old. Ayanna's voice carried the cadence of someone who'd heard these tales countless times, who'd absorbed their rhythms into her bones. She had one about a warrior who came home from battle so changed that he couldn't recognize his own reflection in the water. Samuel set down his fork, his appetite suddenly secondary to the pull of her words. What happened to him? He wandered for many seasons, avoiding other people because he couldn't bear their questions or their pity. He lived alone in the high places, where only the wind and eagles could find him. Ayanna's voice took on the measured pace of traditional storytelling, each word chosen with care. "But eagles," grandmother said, "see everything from above. They see how all the broken pieces fit together in patterns too large for ground walkers to understand." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending Ghost's place by the fire. Samuel found himself leaning forward, drawn by something in Ayanna's voice that he couldn't name. Not just the story itself, but the way she held it, like something precious and alive. The eagle told the warrior that his reflection looked strange because he was trying to see his old self in new water. "The water is different now," the eagle said. "And so are you. But different doesn't mean broken. Sometimes it just means deeper." Ayanna's hands moved slightly as she spoke, shaping the air in small gestures that seemed to pull meaning from invisible spaces. Samuel found his chest tight, his breathing shallow. And then the warrior learned to look deeper into water, past his scars and his strangeness, until he could see not just who he had been or who he was, but who he might become. And when he finally returned to his people, he brought with him the eagle's gift of seeing patterns, how pain could become wisdom, how silence could become peace, how even the deepest wounds could teach the heart new ways to be strong. The story settled between them like smoke from the fire, present but not pressing, there for whatever comfort they might draw from it. Samuel stared into his coffee cup, seeing his own reflection wavering in the dark surface. "Your grandmother sounds like she understood soldiers," he said finally. "She understood anyone who'd been to war, whether with enemies or with themselves." Ayanna began clearing the dishes, her movements unhurried. She said stories were medicine, but like all medicine, they work best when the person is ready to heal. Samuel nodded slowly, something loosening in his chest that had been clenched tight for years. "I used to think healing meant forgetting, going back to who I was before. Maybe healing means something different," Ayanna suggested gently. "Maybe it means learning to carry what you've been through without letting it carry you." As she washed dishes in the basin, Samuel found himself watching her hands move through the soapy water, sure, graceful, unafraid of their own strength. For the first time in years, his kitchen felt less like a place where he merely survived and more like a place where he might actually live. "Would you?" He started, then stopped, the words catching his throat like burrs. "Would I what?" Ayanna asked without turning around, giving him the dignity of not having to meet her eyes while he struggled with vulnerability. "Would you tell me another story sometime, if it's not too much trouble?" "Stories are never trouble," Ayanna said, and he could hear the smile in her voice even though he couldn't see her face. "They're just seeds waiting for the right time to grow." Outside, the wind sang through the eaves, carrying the scent of coming rain, and the distant call of coyotes beginning their nightly conversations. Inside, two people who'd learned to be careful with trust sat in comfortable quiet, each beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, healing didn't have to be a solitary journey after all. 3 weeks passed in the rhythm of shared work and careful words. Samuel found himself listening for Ayanna's footsteps each morning, the soft sound of her voice greeting Ghost, the particular way she hummed while working, small melodies that seemed to rise from some deep, unbroken place inside her. She told him stories while they mended harnesses, while they drove cattle to winter pasture, while the coffee cooled between their hands in the evening quiet. But this morning was different. Samuel woke before dawn to the sound of his own voice crying out, the bedsheets soaked with sweat and tangled around his thrashing limbs. The nightmare had been particularly vivid. Shiloh again. The cornfield turned into an abattoir. Young Billy Morrison calling for his mother while his life leaked out between Samuel's fingers. Some memories never lost their teeth, never stopped biting. He sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, waiting for his heart to remember how to beat normally. Through the window, he could see smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney. Ayanna was awake, probably had been since his shouting started. The thought made his stomach clench with shame. So much for careful distance, for keeping his broken pieces from cutting anyone else. When he finally emerged, she was feeding the chickens, scattering grain with practiced motions while Ghost supervised from his usual post. She looked up when Samuel appeared, taking in his haggard face and red-rimmed eyes without comment or judgment. "Coffee's ready," she said simply, as if nightmares were just another kind of weather to be endured and then forgotten. They worked through the morning in quieter silence than usual, Samuel's movements stiff with exhaustion and embarrassment. Every time he caught Ayanna watching him with those dark, knowing eyes, he felt exposed, raw as a fresh wound. He'd worked so hard to build walls around his worst memories, and now they were crumbling like poorly mortared stone. "I'm sorry," he said finally, as they paused to water the horses. "About this morning. About the noise." Ayanna studied his face with her characteristic directness. "What are you sorry for? Dreams aren't something a person chooses. For disturbing your sleep. For being—" Samuel struggled for words that wouldn't sound like self-pity. "For being damaged goods." "My grandmother had dreams too," Ayanna said quietly, stroking the mare's neck with gentle hands. "After the soldiers came to our winter camp. After she watched her youngest son try to protect the lodges and fail." She paused, her fingers finding a knot in the horse's mane and working it loose with infinite patience. She used to wake screaming his name, calling for him to run, to hide, to live. Samuel felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, but opening, like ice giving way to spring water. What did she do? How did she make it stop? She didn't try to make it stop. She learned to make it mean something different. Ayanna's voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. She would get up after the dreams and tell me stories about him, not about how he died, but about how he lived. His laugh, his terrible jokes, the way he could track a rabbit through stone if he set his mind to it. Samuel's throat felt tight. I'd dream about Shiloh, about the boys who didn't come home. Tell me about one of them, Ayanna said softly. Not how he died, how he lived. For a long moment, Samuel couldn't speak. Then, haltingly, words began to emerge. Billy Morrison, 19 years old, from a farm outside Springfield. He could whistle like a meadowlark. Used to wake us up with it instead of reveille. Drove the sergeants crazy, but nobody had the heart to stop him because it was so damn beautiful. Ayanna nodded, her attention complete and patient. What else? He wrote letters to his sweetheart every day, even when we didn't have paper. He'd practice on tree bark, on the backs of playing cards, anywhere he could find space. Used to read them out loud sometimes, the real ones, and we'd all pretend not to listen while he poured his heart out to some girl named Mary Catherine, who probably forgot his name the day he left. The words came easier now, flowing like water through a dam that had finally found a crack. Samuel found himself talking about Billy's laugh, his stubborn optimism, the way he'd shared his last piece of hardtack with a stray dog that followed their company for 3 days. He sounds like someone worth remembering, Ayanna said when Samuel's words finally ran dry. They all were. Samuel leaned against the fence post, feeling lighter somehow, as if speaking Billy's name had lifted some invisible weight from his shoulders. I never talk about them, never say their names. Names have power, Ayanna said, echoing something her grandmother had taught her. When we stop speaking them, we let people die twice, once in the body, once in memory. But when we tell their stories, when we remember their laughter instead of just their silence, they live in a different way. Samuel looked at her with something approaching wonder. How do you know these things? How do you always know exactly what to say? I don't, Ayanna admitted with a slight smile. But my grandmother's stories live in my head, and sometimes they whisper the right words when I need them most. Sometimes the best healing comes not from forgetting our ghosts, but from learning to carry them with honor instead of shame. As they walked back toward the house, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in 27 years, the possibility that his memories might be transformed from tormentors into something else entirely, not forgotten, not erased, but perhaps, with time and the right stories, alchemized into a different kind of strength. That night, when the dreams came again, Samuel woke not with screams, but with Billy Morrison's whistle echoing in his ears, sweet and clear as morning bird song, carrying his friend's joy across the years like a gift that death couldn't steal. November brought the kind of cold that crept into bones and settled there like a permanent resident. The first snow fell on a Tuesday morning, fat flakes drifting down like pieces of torn sky, while Samuel and Ayanna worked to move the cattle closer to the shelter of the barn. Ghost bounded through the drifts with the joy of a creature remembering ancient winters, his thick coat already growing dense against the coming months. Storm's building, Samuel observed, squinting at the gray wall advancing across the prairie. Big one by the look of it. We'll need to bring horses in. Make sure we got enough feed to last if we're snowed in for a few days. Ayanna nodded, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Over the past month, they'd fallen into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. Work shared without discussion, meals taken in comfortable quiet. Evenings spent by the fire while she told stories, and he listened with the intensity of a man discovering religion. But this storm felt different, more serious than the quick squalls they'd weathered so far. The bunkhouse stove draws poorly in heavy wind, Samuel said, not quite looking at her as they secured the barn doors. Chimney needs work I haven't gotten around to. If this storm's as bad as it looks, you might want to... He stopped, color rising in his weathered cheeks. Might want to what? Ayanna asked gently, understanding his struggle but not making it easier. Some things needed to be said plain. House has a good fireplace. Keeps warm even when the wind howls. There's a spare room, if you don't mind. Samuel's words trailed off, but his meaning was clear. He was offering shelter, safety, the warmth of his home without asking for anything in return except her continued presence in his increasingly less solitary world. I'd be grateful, Ayana said simply, and Samuel's shoulders relaxed as if he'd been holding his breath for her answer. They spent the afternoon moving her few possessions to the spare room, a small space behind the kitchen that had probably been meant for a hired help but felt cozy rather than cramped. Ayana hung her grandmother's beadwork on the single nail beside the window and arranged her medicine bundle on the plain wooden table, transforming the anonymous space into something that belonged to her. By evening, the storm had arrived in earnest. Wind howled around the house's corners like something alive and hungry, while snow piled against the windows in drifts that promised to reach the sills by morning. Samuel fed the fire until it roared in the stone hearth, filling the main room with dancing light and blessed warmth. Grandmother had a story about the first snow, Ayana said, settling into the chair across from Samuel with her mending in her lap. Would you like to hear it? Samuel nodded, already learning to anticipate the peace that came with her stories, the way they seemed to smooth the rough edges of whatever emotions the day had stirred up. Long #lonely rancher bought a Kiowa girl sold by her uncle, then learned her stories could heal his silence.